Warhammer 40,000 Renegades, Lord of Excess by Rich McCormick. Chapter 2. The mound of flesh stank. Even for Xantine, who had stood unbowed in the galaxy's most depraved charnel houses, the smell made his lurid turquoise eyes water. For the exhortation's mortal crew, it was too much. Most of them clipped their nostrils closed with pincers of gold or silver, breathing through gauze-wrapped mouths. Others had appended nose bags over their faces, each filled with narcotic herbs and pungent spices, giving them the appearance of large flightless birds as they maneuvered around the cramped bridge. It impeded the crew's work, but they were necessary steps. After all, the mound was far more important than any of them. It was called Gallia, but in truth, it was the exhortation, the ship's brain and body, the muscle that gave it the impetus to run, and the imperative to fight. It had the cognition to make careful and complex jumps, allowing the ship and its master to sail the warp without a living navigator on board. That wasn't technically true. It had been a navigator once, Xantine knew. Gallia was born the youngest daughter of Resh Irilli, one of the many scions of Navigator House Irilli. The house had long been a solid and dependable source of navigators for Terra's small-scale shipping enterprises, but Lady Resh's Epicurean tastes would not be sated by a life considered merely comfortable. Seeking pleasure, she disguised herself and departed the throne world, using her talents to eventually reach the fringes of the Eye of Terror. Xantine had not met Resh Irilli. The lady had died in the employ of a long-departed warlord, whom he didn't care to recall. But she had left a crowd of daughters. Gallia was one of these. More or less baseline in appearance before she had turned her name and her body over to become a pulsing, stinking blob of matter, whose tendrils now ran the full length of the exhortation. It was a difficult business, maintaining a navigator on board a vessel of the Emperor's children. Some simply went mad, the cacophony of sound and sensation too much for their delicate psychic capabilities. Others became distracted. Their minds turned from the minutiae of piloting a vast warship through the eddies and tides of unreality by earthly pains and pleasures. Xantine had seen this happen firsthand. Deploying his silver tongue and the gift of a few hundred slaves, he'd once managed to orchestrate an audience with the dancer in silks, once a brother of the third, and now a choir master of his own warband, the Souls of Splendor. Conscious of the dancer's infamously fickle nature, Xantine had ordered the exhortation to the rendezvous point, with weapons on standby and void shields to full. But of the rival warband there was no sign. Weeks later they discovered their ship, the Splendor's Vision, half embedded in a moon on the outer edge of the system. Investigation of what was left of the stricken craft turned up several dozen transhuman bodies, and Vox recordings that indicated the ship's navigator had been inspecting his reflection in a nearby mirror when his talents were called upon to navigate safely out of the warp. Indeed, the record suggested that he had been admiring himself in the same mirror for the previous standard month, forcing the recently transferred slaves to feed and bathe him so that he would not have to avert his own eyes from his own form. Xantine found it difficult to understand what the navigator saw in the reflected form that bewitched him so, but then, it had been hard to see much of the man by then. The majority of his face had melded into solid rock. Even navigators still enthralled to the Imperium tended to mutate as their careers went on, but those that found themselves in service to warbands like Xantine's own tended to change more rapidly, in more exotic ways, the currents of the warp colliding and coalescing to make them something truly special. This was Gallia. Xantine didn't remember the woman, in truth. She had been sequestered in her chambers at the heart of the ship, communicating primarily with the warlord Euphoros and his bridge crew. He, in turn, had been one of Euphoros's warriors at the time. A trusted and respected warrior, he told himself, but one whose focus was on his own betterment, rather than the vagaries of running a vast void ship. As he took Sajant into himself and wrested control of the warband, and with it the exhortation from Euphoros, he found Gallia already in her flowered state. He had investigated the possibility of removing Gallia from the ship, intending a clean break from Euphoros's previous regime, but the creature was like a tumor that had wormed its way into every vital organ of a body, and it could not be excised without killing the host. Instead, he simply accepted the reality. and in the process discovered the sublime power of the creature. It did stink, though. Raedron, the statuesque shipmaster, had a more eloquent way of dealing with the problem. She had simply removed her nose. The new flesh filled the center of her face where the offending organ had previously stood, puckering and pink against the sallow skin surrounding it. It made her look permanently surprised, Xantine thought, an effect compounded by the large and complex hairpiece she wore atop her head. Ringlets and curls of shimmering gold were held in place by feathers of magenta and blue-green, their shafts piercing the skin of her scalp to ensure that the whole edifice didn't move. She hoisted her silvered cane and prodded the mass of quivering flesh in its flank. It squealed, recoiling from her touch, before settling back with an annoying harumph. Raedron spoke to the awakened mass. "We have suffered an unexpected translation from the warp. The magnificent Xantine demands to know what has brought us back to real space." For a moment there was no response, and she prodded Gallia again. After another squeal, and from deep inside the creature's lumpen form, a vox grill appeared. A voice followed, its words clipped and precise as a machine's, but punctuated by wet, slurping sounds. "Cause unknown. Warp drive offline. Navigational course unplanned. Bring the warp drive back online and plot a course to the system's Mandeville point," Raedron snapped. "Impossible," Gallia slurped. "Complex warp currents circle this region of the void, rendering this system's Mandeville point unusable." Raedron sniffed in annoyance. "Where are we?" she asked, directing her question to the bridge crew, who sat close by, partially bonded to ornate cogitators. A flame-haired man turned, eager to provide an answer. "Recent Imperial records have no mention of this world, my lady, but older data sources make reference to a planet named Serene. It was an agri-world. The records show that the world produced vital ingredients used in rejuvenant treatments. Population was confined to cities split between the cloud line." "How old are these records?" Raedron asked. "From centuries past, my lady." Raedron went to continue, but Xantine cut in, his deep voice quieting all other conversation. "And the population, are they still present?" The flame-haired man's voice quivered, but he answered the warlord directly. "At present, Auspex scans show increased concentrations of physaline and promethium in the local atmosphere." Raedron took up the explanation, keen for the praise. "Telltale signs of explosions, your magnificence. The human population remains, and there appears to be some unpleasantness amongst their number," she said. Xantine let a grin play across blackened lips. This world could be a rare prize indeed, sweet, juicy, and ripe with plunder. Certainly it could offer more than their most recent jaunts. Xantine and the Adored had been reduced to raiding mining colonies in recent years, and more often than not lately, they came across the carcasses of worlds already picked clean by their fellow renegades, their resources plundered, their weapons purloined, their people slaughtered, sacrificed, or taken into slavery. More than once they found Imperial worlds that had beaten them to the kill and immolated themselves. Bax 3, where a brave Titan Legio splintered and fought itself to a standstill, in the rubble of the only continent's largest city, evenly matched and unable to accept defeat. Both factions elected to detonate their Titans' plasma reactors, killing millions and irradiating the settlement far beyond habitable status. The two princeps seniores responsible for the destruction, sisters by birth, had but one fundamental disagreement: whether the Emperor was dead, or had simply forsaken his Imperium. Horsk, whose planetary governor had sabotaged their void shielding, asphyxiating the world, preferring a quick and silent death to the oblivion promised by the cicatrix maledictum. Xantine had kept the governor's journal, and found it made pleasurable reading to chart the perverse logic that led the one man, a mortal one at that, to take the lives of millions with a single action. The governor's writing remained level-headed to the last, the man never giving in to the ravenings and madness that many in his situation might have spewed when presented with such a vision into unreality. Xantine couldn't fault the man's argument. He only wished he had been there when he took the shields down to watch the spectacle firsthand. Each offered a morsel of misery, but for a warband low on the harsh realities of their trade, ammunition, weapons, slaves, and narcotics, these were wasted journeys that further depleted their stockpiles. Xantine stood on the dead ground of these worlds and wept, knowing that their spoils had gone to lesser beings, shrieking lunatic followers of the blood god, dour droning devotees of Nurgle, or the endlessly tiresome lackeys of the Changer of Ways. Worse still, they sometimes found the telltale brands of the Black Legion presence. Abaddon's gaggle of morons, barbarians, and cowards had been attempting to follow the Adored for decades now. Xantine had lost track exactly how long. It was a chase that would continue until either Xantine or Abaddon were dead, he knew. The War Master of the Black Legion could never forgive the murder of both a lieutenant and a favoured pet, and Xantine's subsequent flight from the Children of Torment, and the formation of his own warband, rubbed salt in the wound of a being whose subjugation of the galaxy hinged on subjugating his fellow renegade Astartes first. That Abaddon had yet to find the Adored, Xantine took as a confirmation of his own brilliance. The alternative, that the War Master simply did not care to look, or even know who Xantine was, did not cross his mind. Fortunately, Abaddon's brutes were easy to feint, always moving in straight lines, while Xantine allowed the whims and predilections of his crew to guide the movements of the Adored. Bavisk, the Noise Marine, his closest brother, forever chasing the song of Slaanesh. Quarren Toon, the Diabolist, once a word-bearer, but now consumed by his passions, as any of Xantine's gene brothers, tireless in his search for exotic Neverborn to test and catalogue. Sarquil, the orchestrator, his obsessions more practical than any of his ragged legion, ensuring that the Adored obtained men and material, and they were low on both. This was a risk, Xantine knew. To invade a world of the Imperium, even one in the midst of an uprising, but Serene was too tasty a morsel to give up. A chance for the Adored to live on scraps no longer. I can give you so much more, Sajanth purred. He ignored her and savoured the moment. A world, a whole unsullied world, with its soft belly exposed. How delicious. Truly a boon from the youngest god. Xantine traced his tongue around blackened lips and spoke. Oh, how Pyrrhod hated running. His knees complained as he pumped legs rendered weak through lack of use, and felt sweat turning the silk of his trousers rough. Elise hadn't even oiled his dry heels this morning. He remembered, an extra huff of air escaping the realization. If he made it out of here alive, he was going to have very cracked skin tomorrow morning. He missed Rogier. How could he be expected to run with such abject grief weighing him down? Abject grief and the multi-course breakfast that his manservant had prepared for him. The explosions had been coming closer since the first light, and as the sun rose in the sky, they had been joined by a chorus of screams. After he served breakfast to the roused Pyrrhod, Rogier had taken to pacing the polished floor of his master's chalet, and no attempts to reassure him seemed to salve his frustration. Rogier, Pyrrhod called. Sweetly at first. We're safe here, my friend. Like everything in this chalet. The walls were beautiful, rendered in green marble, layered with veins of gold. But they were functional too. A core of ferrocrete kept out the cold of the night high above the ground, and would serve to stop armaments short of a battle cannon shell. A foundation stone stood above the doorway, an heirloom that his father told him had been brought from Terra itself, mined from the ancient quarries of Frank. And he had guards. They were tough, small-eyed men who patrolled the perimeter of his chalet, sturdy lasguns held at the ready. He saw them sometimes through the building's double windows, as they completed their rounds, their bald heads bobbing slightly as they walked. It must have been a ritual. That severe hairstyle, or perhaps some kind of challenge. Or maybe it was just the new fashion. Pyrrhod had resolved to check. Never wanted to miss a trend. But he couldn't see his guards now, and he was really getting quite worried. Rogier, he called again, injecting a little steel into his voice. His manservant didn't look up, continuing his pacing. Irritation boiled over into rage as Pyrrhod's prodigious gut, an ugly emotion stoked by fear and a lifetime of having his own way. Rogier, get over here this instant, he screeched. Rogier looked up, and Pyrrhod was sure for a moment that he had reawakened the man's sense of duty, but for the first time during their long association, his manservant did not obey his order. Instead, Rogier turned on his heels and flung open the chalet's ornate hardwood door, a beautiful piece commissioned by Pyrrhod's father, and prepared to run from his master's well-appointed domicile. Rogier took but a single step before he was bisected by a saw blade the size of a Torok's hatch. It slammed through his midsection and embedded itself deep in the antique wood of the doorframe. Pyrod saw him die from a position popped up on cushions on a 7-seater couch. He watched as Rogier's legs slumped lazily to the floor, separated from a torso that still stood atop the blade, proud and tall like one of the cakes Lady Salome served at her midnight banquets. And he winced as red blood, thick and wine-dark, leaked from Rogier's wet insides. The pool expanded until it soaked against the thick rug that bore Pyrod's family crest. He wanted to weep then. That rug had been woven by the child artisans of Dilton, but abject panic had forced him from his comfortable couch, his pudgy legs maneuvering his bulk towards the hatch in his wine cellar that concealed one of the chalet's multiple escape tunnels. The whole thing was such a shame, Pyrod thought, as he waddled past faintly glowing lumen bulbs towards an exit he hoped was closer than it appeared. Though, if he was honest, he did think it rather served Rogier right for opening the door in the first place, rather than tending to his master. What was he shouting about anyway? Pyrod wondered for a moment whether the manservant had a family. He'd never thought to ask, but he realized he didn't really care. All that mattered was that it wasn't his name, and that his faithful attendant of the last 17 years had forced Serene's esteemed vice-treasurer to run. The indignity of it all, Pyrod blustered to himself, as he stumbled, sweating, to a halt against the tunnel's exit hatch. His chest heaved, but over the sound of laboured breathing, he could hear the noises of battle, the regular crack of autogun, the boom of explosions, and screaming, rising and falling in waves. But there was another sound too, the one he was desperately relieved to hear, the whine of engines. Serene's void port was close, and still functional. He would make his way to a ship, use his connections, and escape into the comfort of the void while the planetary militia dealt with this unpleasantness. He would survive this day, he resolved. Cracked heels be damned. It was never quiet aboard the Exhortation. Squeals and moans, shrieks and howls penetrated even its darkest corners. The engine decks, where grinning once-humans danced between arterial cables that pumped viscous and stinking red liquids. The hold, even the bilges vibrated with sound, and sleek, smooth-skinned creatures swam through centuries of accumulated narcotic runoff, sending ripples and tides through the sloshing effluent. Behind it all, a discordant drone set the meter, the sound of the universe itself, of all the beauty and all the pain it contained within. To a mortal, these sounds were terror given voice. To Xantine, they were music, and he hummed along as he walked the Exhortation's thickly carpeted hallways, on his way to visit his brother Vavisk. "Why must we converse with your kin?" Sergeant asked, as Xantine strode towards Vavisk's chamber. "Because they are brothers of the Emperor's children, and I desire their counsel." "Lies. You court their approval because you fear that they will betray you." Xantine laughed. It was a hollow sound. "You share my body, demon, but you will never understand my kind." "I know your soul," Sergeant said. "You seek to turn your brothers to your cause. It is a foolish aim, and a foolish cause. We are so powerful, my love. We need not this world, nor your duplicitous brothers." "Not powerful enough," Xantine admitted. "You wish to return to your former glory? Then we require weapons, supplies, and slaves. This world will have each in abundance." "You are wrong," the demon said. "This world is diseased, and I know it." "Then I will be its cure. I will hear no more on the matter." Xantine turned his attention fully to the artworks displayed on the walls of the Exhortation's central corridors. Many of the pieces were on show were his own. A representation of Canticle City before its destruction by the Black Legion, completed in crystal and bone shards. A careful study of Eldari physiology, created by pressing one of that perfidious race between two panes of transparent plasteel until they were microns apart, presented in a gold-leafed frame. His gene-father had been an artist. Xantine felt he reflected his Primarch's talents in the field, but where Fulgrim had worked in traditional media, Xantine yearned for new canvases, new materials. He could rarely predict when his inspiration would strike, and so had left his right pauldron unadorned, at odds with the complex and ornate patterns, colours, and images rendered upon the rest of his armour. The pearlescent surface was a blank slate, and he often turned to it during the chemical rush of battle, painting with the raw materials of combat, blood, excrement, and the countless other bodily fluids of the galaxy's species. Fluids of which Xantine had an encyclopedic knowledge. By now, it was a palimpsest of excess, scrubbed almost clean after each sortie, but redolent with the memories and stink of wars once savoured, of enemies once slaughtered. His other shoulder bore a trophy from one such foe, a long-snouted skull of some exotic Xenos creature, its lower jaw removed, its brightly feathered skin still attached to the white bone in patches. Xantine had broken the silken spear on its hide, shattering the ancient Eldari weapon that had once served as the key that locked Xantine in her arcane prison. A shard of that spear now formed the blade of Xantine's rapier, a weapon he called simply Anguish, set into a guard fashioned from a carved Eldari bone. He often wore his full plate, even while aboard the Exhortation, enjoying the suite of sensations that the ceramite transmitted to his supple skin. It was a show of power to walk the decks of his own ship, so conspicuously armoured, a message to his underlings that he would accept challenges at a moment's notice. He had wrestled the frigate from its previous owner, his former commander, Euphoros, a lethal combatant, and Sajant was at least partially correct. There were those among his current crew that undoubtedly eyed a similar line of succession. Keeping them in line required not just raw strength, something Sajant assisted with, but symbols too. This symbology was the reason why Xantine had donned his full armour now. It was an amalgam of parts scavenged from burning battlefields and taken as trophies in single combat, but it was built around the core of his original warplate, and as a member of the Emperor's Children under the command of Primarch Fulgrim. He knew the breastplate, even with its winged claw warped so that its talons curved into a symbol of Slanesh, would spark fealty and honour in the twin hearts of his most trusted brother. He met Vavisk in the Chamber of Exaltation. At the rear of the Exhortation, his brother was a choir master to the adored's host of noise marines. And although Xantine could not see the warriors, he could certainly hear them. They were singing louder than he ever heard them, the secretive clade having raised their volume and tempo since the frigate had arrived in system, the sound reverberating through the bones and the fluids of his body, exciting the blood in his veins, the acid in his stomach, the humour in his eyes. They were orchestrated by Vavisk, who conducted their unseen choir from the organ of bliss. The vast edifice was a contraption of Vavisk's own design, requiring the obsessive work of decades to find the most beautiful voices in the galaxy, or at least the most talented singers unfortunate enough to find themselves in the path of the adored, before bringing them into the fold. Xantine had seen the organ countless times, had even diverted the Exhortation's course to help his brother complete his opus, but the device still impressed him. Vavisk stood in the centre, singing into a greatly quivering orifice that connected to a forest of golden pipes. These pipes curved up and around each other like bundles of nerves before plunging deep into the neck of a human mortal. Other tubes burrowed into the human's barreled stomachs, passing enough nutrient paste to keep them well fed and ensure their voices had sufficient power. Larger tubes carried waste away from their lower intestines and bladders, while finer cables connected to wrists and ankles, capturing readouts on their vital functions. Vavisk was protective, reacting quickly to sickness or other malaise in any of the individual humans that made it up. The results were quite mesmerizing. As Vavisk sang, his voice was amplified 100-fold, taken up by row upon row of these human instruments. Their jaws worked in perfect time with each other, reproducing the same notes and tempo, but imbuing the composition with their own specific timbre. Xantine lingered a moment, allowing his brother to continue his current overture without disruption. It was Vavisk who called a halt to the song, quieting the organ of bliss and hauling the warp-racked body to its feet. Xantine greeted him as he rose. "Quite the composition, Vavisk," he said, inspecting the blades that jutted from his greaves with an air of practiced nonchalance. Once he would have embraced his brother, savouring the touch of a cultured warrior. Even in the relative privacy of the chamber, it wouldn't do to show such deference to a subordinate. Still, part of his body longed for the contact, Vavisk was his oldest friend, so much as that term still had meaning in the legion of pleasure seekers and hedonists. At the very least, of all the beings in the galaxy, it was Vavisk who had done the most for Xantine, not the legion selectors who plucked him from the noble schools of Chemos, nor the sergeants and captains of the Emperor's children, nor even his dilettante Primarch. The Phoenician's attentions turned from his own children to pleasures beyond comprehension. It was Vavisk who was inducted into the Emperor's children alongside Xantine, Vavisk who fought alongside him during the Great Crusade. Memories of fighting for the Corpse Emperor left a taste like ash in Xantine's mouth, but Vavisk's bravery and loyalty was a true prize from that conflict. It was Vavisk who pulled him from the wreckage of Canticle City as Abaddon hurled the warship Tlaloc down on the world of Harmony. Were it not for his brother's intervention, Xantine would have been incinerated along with thousands of his fellow Emperor's children and millions of mortals, his remains joining the vast field of melted glass, rock, and biological matter that was all that remained of the once beautiful civilization on the planet. It was Vavisk who stood alongside him as Xantine turned on his warlord, using the strength of the demon sharing his body to decapitate Euphorus, also once of the Third Legion, before he'd become Abaddon's lapdog. Xantine had taken the exhortation and run from the Black Legion, shrieking out on his own with his dearest brother at his side, and that was why it hurt to see Vavisk so addled. Yes, Xantine, they sing because we are closer than ever before to finding our Primarch and uniting our Legion once more. Xantine fought hard not to roll his turquoise eyes. He revelled in Vavisk's brotherhood, but the Noise Marine always wanted more. The flight from Abaddon's band of barbarians and thugs had rekindled the spirit of unification in Vavisk's breast, and he longed now to bring the disparate and capricious warbands of the Emperor's children back together under the patrician gaze of their ascended Primarch. Guiding him on this mission was a song that Vavisk claimed to hear, an undulating, primordial rhythm that he desperately attempted to capture in the hope of finding the Palace of Slaanesh, whereupon their Primarch would be convinced to return to his children. Xantine, for his part, could only hear the random and chaotic howls of a galaxy of pain and pleasure, beautiful to his ears though it was. Xantine indulged his brother in this fantasy, even facilitated the creation of projects such as the Organ of Bliss, but Xantine was a scholar of culture. He knew the Emperor's children could not truly reunite as a legion. After 10,000 years of indulgence in the Long War, his brothers were far too mercurial and preoccupied for that. More importantly, even if they could somehow be persuaded to put their countless differences aside, the return of an attentive fulcrum as a catalyst, for example, then it meant a return to subordination for Xantine. Vavisk continued, warming to his subject. We will be whole, Xantine. A legion once more, singing together in worship. He wheezed as he spoke, the sound like damp air forced through an ancient accordion. Xantine stepped alongside his oldest friend. We have been presented with a new opportunity, brother. A world upon which we can sate ourselves, he said with a forced breeziness. He began pacing the stage, dark wood beams bending slightly with each armoured tread. It is a world unsullied by our cousins, yet cut off from the septic glare of the Corpse Emperor. He turned to the Noise Marine. We can take it, and make it ours, Vavisk. Vavisk said nothing. Imagine, Xantine went on, a cathedral built in your name, with you as the conductor guiding thousands, millions of worshippers in song. Join me, support me, and I can give you that. I need no cathedral, Xantine. I need no worshippers, Vavisk said, still staring out across the chamber. Neither do you, brother. The song leads us on to divine pleasure, and every missed step takes us further from these distractions. But think of the hall, Vavisk. Grander than this meagre hold, think of the instruments, the voices you could raise. And what happens while we build this folly? The song keeps rhythm without us. Xantine reoriented his approach. This is a sweet opportunity to refuel, to rearm, to reacquaint ourselves with the tastes of the galaxy. My adored need sustenance, Vavisk. Pleasure shared is pleasure doubled. Do not stand in their way. I have spoken with Sarquil. I know we have sufficient war gear, consumables, and slaves to last until we reach the Eye and rejoin with our brothers. Another angle. How many battles have you joined with me, Vavisk? What is one more for the sake of our brotherhood? Our blades flashing together in glorious combat. Xantine waited a beat in the hope that this cut would land. I'm no fool, Xantine, Vivisk said, his blood-red eyes flashing with a moment of anger. I understand well enough your machinations. This is no courtesy. You need my support to convince our brothers to prosecute this attack. If you have chosen to speak with me now, ahead of the vote, then you suspect that we may not win. We are the Emperor's children. We do not fight if we cannot win. We can always triumph, brother. With you at my side, we can win any day. Bavisk turned then, finally, and stared back at his warlord, his millennia of strained experience worn hard on a wreckage of a face. He had never been beautiful, where so many of the Emperor's children had taken the rarefied features from their gene-sire. Their high cheekbones, their narrow nose, their violet eyes. Bavisk had a squarer jaw that betrayed his birth in one of Kimos's factory families. He had always looked, Xantine thought, after first serving alongside the Iron Hands during the Great Crusade, like one of Ferrus Manus's brood. That resemblance had been noted by their brothers in the Emperor's children, jealous of their bond, no doubt, who had teased them for their similarity to Fulgrim and Ferrus. Xantine, with his delicate features and shoulder-length hair, while Bavisk with his pugnacious mane and straightforward attitude. The good nature had evaporated from that teasing when Fulgrim lopped his brother's head off on Istvan V, but still it persisted, as brothers became rivals in the warbands that metastasized from the stricken body of his legion. It had only stopped for good in recent years, now that Bavisk looked like he did. The resemblance was long gone now. He barely resembled a human. His once square jaw had collapsed, subsumed into a voxgril that made up the lower part of his face. Xantine was not sure whether the grill was a relic of Bavisk's Mark IV helmet, or whether it had simply sprouted unbidden from inside the legionary's lumpen form. But after millennia spent playing with the tides of the warp, he knew better than to try and obtain a solid answer. The skin above it hung loose, falling from buried cheekbones like tallow from the burning candle. Sparse tufts of desiccated white hair grew in clumps on a liver-spotted head, framing engorged ears that had grown fluted to better catch sound, and eyes so bloodshot that the irises were stained red. They were always so tired, those eyes. Why do you think I follow you, Xantine? Bavisk asked. Because I am powerful, Xantine replied, the self-evidence of the statement obvious. Bavisk sighed. You could be the greatest of us, Xantine, he said, his tone suddenly as tired as his eyes. But you have shackled yourself to this thing that wears your skin. This form of command doesn't suit you. It was Xantine's turn to anger. Watch your tongue, brother, lest I pull it from that ruin of a throat and watch it myself, he warned. He felt Sergeant rise in his breast at the spike of rage he had inadvertently fed her, circling his consciousness like a sea beast that had tasted a drop of blood in the water. He is insolent, my sweet, she purred as she coiled herself around him. He will turn against us. No, Xantine shot back, not him. I ask for your counsel, Bavisk, because you have shown yourself to be wise, but wisdom comes in many forms. The wisdom to know when to fight, and the wisdom to know when to retreat. When to acquiesce to the desires of your betters. Xantine felt Sergeant's presence pulse in his body, as his anger blossomed. This is my ship, and the adored are my warriors. You are my warrior. When I call on you, I expect you to answer me, or else I will return you to Abaddon myself to answer for your crimes. Bavisk, for the first time in millennia, was silent. Even the mouths of his neck had ceased their incessant whispering. Red eyes stared in hooded sockets, the gloom rendering them almost black. Strike him, Sergeant whispered. No one can stand against us. Xantine turned and strode from the room. His right hand was clenching and unclenching, forming a fist and releasing it without his control. I thought that was a pretty interesting chapter. I feel like Xantine is doomed. I feel like this interaction really foreshadows a lot, potentially. But then again, it's a very obvious foreshadowing. I feel like feel as if Vivisk is a true kind of worshipper of Slaanesh, whereas Xantine is so narcissistic. It's absolutely. I think he's a great character. Like, he's a flawed, egotistical. He's exactly what you think of an Emperor's Children Space Marine, without necessarily going into the cartoonish villain vibe. I'm curious to see how it's going to develop. I worry. I think Xantine's errand is doomed because both. It's not just him. It's not just Vivisk that's against him, but the demon Sajanth, the demon that's possessed him, that he shares his body with, also thinks this is a dumb idea. That they're well equipped enough that they should just go to the Eye of Terror. And I get the feeling that Xantine is going to be left behind, and Vivisk is going to take the ship and go. And I think Vivisk might be the character we see in the future if they do follow up to this book. I'm also curious to see what I feel like the politician guy, the noble guy. I think he's going to be one of the first people that Xantine meets and his crew meets, and it's going to be absolutely hilarious. I'm really curious to see what happens. But yeah, I guess we'll continue in the next video.